Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannick, and today we are exploring how we change the world. Cool, huh? We're going to unpack how social change actually works with Laila Kassam, who is incredibly knowledgeable about social justice, social change, movement building, the stuff that changes the world for the better, the powerful actions that we can take collectively to help the victims of systematic violence. I think you're going to really enjoy this one. I'm so honored to have Laila on the show. She's based in the UK and she's spent the last decade or so researching and studying what works in social movements and creating mass change for good, not only for animals, but looking at past social justice strategies and what works, what hasn't worked. And she's now applying what she's learned with her new organization, Project Phoenix. And we're going to hear all about that. And so much of what we're going to talk about applies to really every level, every aspect of communicating our message about animals, our vegan message. A lot of this information can apply to really every level of outreach or activism or just being vegan and talking about being vegan. This conversation was so inspiring to me. Laila is thinking big. She has a big vision, a global vision with really hopeful possibilities of actual animal freedom, ending animal farming, and how that is possible in a fairly shorter time frame than we might think. This interview was so packed with good information. I didn't want to cut anything. So we're going to jump right in. I hope you enjoy it. All right, I am really excited to bring in our guest. Today we have Laila Kassam. She is the executive director of a new organization, Project Phoenix. Before that, she co founded Animal Think Tank, where she worked for 6 years. And she's on the board of We the Free, on the advisory board of Animal Advocacy Careers and the Empathy Project, and a mentor for Kickstarting for Good. She's co editor of the book Rethinking Food and Agriculture New Ways Forward, which envisions a truly just and sustainable food system. Welcome to the podcast, Laila.
Oh, thank you so much, Hope. It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. I've been wanting to have you on for a long time, a few years now, because I'd followed your work with Animal Think Tank and love what you were doing there. And you recently wrote an article that I thought was fantastic, and that post really prompted me to reach out and invite you on. So thank you for all the good work you've been doing.
Oh, thanks, Hope.
Yeah. So let's start with our first question, just to kind of get to know you question. So, why and when did you go vegan?
Okay, so about 15 years ago, I had begun exploring meditation and spirituality, and it really opened up something in me. I started to see just how deeply conditioned we are, and I was in my beliefs, my habits, and yes, even in what or who I was eating. And I was really drawn to living more mindfully. And the principle of ahimsa, nonviolence, causing as little harm as possible, really resonated with me. So as I deepened my practice, I found myself looking at my food differently. You know, I'd be eating a burger or a steak, and suddenly I'd see not just a meal, but I'd see the body of a once living, feeling being. So the corpse of a tortured animal, basically. And as you know, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I went vegetarian. Didn't want to be complicit in violence anymore. But yeah, I didn't fully understand at that point the violence behind eggs and dairy. And like many people, I thought, well, cows aren't killed for milk and eggs are just a byproduct. But as I learned more, I saw the reality that there was often more violence in those things. And so, even though I didn't actually know any vegans back then, I was really lucky. I have two wonderful sisters, and they'd gone vegetarian several years before I had. And we were all learning and talking and figuring things out together. So, I think it was 2013, we each made the decision to go vegan. separately, but with mutual encouragement and support. And I think, the shift in consciousness that I think that the spirituality, the meditation had brought that had led me to going vegan wasn't just about other animals. It touched every part of my life. I'd always cared about human rights, global inequality, environmental justice, all these issues. But I started to realize, how all of these injustices were connected. So yeah, that's my story. I haven't looked back since going vegan. And like so many other people, I think my only regret is I didn't do it sooner.
Yeah, don't we hear that all the time? And it's true. We really feel that we just, wish we had done this our whole lives and hadn't caused any suffering. So I didn't know that you kind of came at it a little bit from a spiritual angle with the ahimsa and
Yeah.
kind of just feeling that you didn't want to cause harm. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Yeah.
was, I think even though I really did care about animals when I was much younger, I think, and I'd actually gone vegetarian when I was 16 for about a year and then kind of forgot about it. I don't know what happened. Yeah, it was through the meditation and I think just wanting to be a better person in general that kind of brought me to veganism.
Yeah. So let's get into your work. So you recently started Project Phoenix. It's a very, very young organization after co-founding Animal Think Tank. And I love Animal Think Tank. I love the work that you did there. And that was for about 6 years, I think. So talk about this trajectory that this journey from Animal Think Tank to Project Phoenix. What inspired you to make this shift?
Okay, yeah, so it's been a long journey. I think we started Animal Think Tank back in 2018. So that was me and my two co-founders, Mark Westcombe and Dan Kidby. And at that time, we knew that we needed a mass movement for animal freedom, but we just didn't really know how to build one. So we spent several years doing, a lot of deep work, studying past and present social movements, learning about community organizing, exploring and researching narrative strategy, and speaking with and learning from movement leaders both inside the animal movement and also outside, so other movements as well. And those 6 years were really foundational for me. I sort of feel like they were an apprenticeship in social movement theory and practice. And I feel like I came away from that experience with a very clear vision and understanding of what I believe makes a movement powerful enough to win lasting systemic change. And I also, I think, realized on a sort of very deep level, and it was quite uncomfortable to realize this, but that the UK animal movement has, brilliant people, great organizations, but we don't yet have the power that we need to make meaningful change for other animals. We don't have a strong grassroots infrastructure. We don't have deep coordination. We don't have a shared freedom-centered story. And, crucially, we lost the kind of local ecosystem and the grassroots network that had powered earlier UK wins like bans on fur farming, bans on live export, cosmetic testing, wild animals and circuses. So it was a really big learning curve, both in terms of social movement theory and practice, and also in terms of building an organization, which is a whole other challenge. And even though the three of us started out with this goal of building a mass movement over time, Animal Think Tank increasingly wanted to go deeper into the research, whereas I think, the last couple of years that I was there, I really felt that we had reached a point where the next phase of learning had to come through actually doing, so through experimentation, through building, through organizing in real communities. So at the beginning of last year, so 2024, I met Tom Harris, who you may know. He's a veteran organizer and campaigner who coordinated the SHAT campaign. So that was the campaign called Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, which was one of the most dynamic campaigns the UK had seen. And, he and several others who were involved in coordinating that campaign paid a very sort of heavy price for that work because they went to prison. But meeting Tom and he's got more than 2 decades of sort of lived experience of campaigning and organizing in the grassroots in the UK. Our visions aligned immediately, and mine, I suppose, was informed by and rooted in research and movement theory, while his was very much rooted in like practice and experimentation and his lived experience. So with Tom and also with Natalie Brain, who is Animal Think Tank's narrative lead, like the three of us, I think, realized that, we were seeing the same gap. We were seeing the same opportunity, that we had this shared vision to do something together and really put into practice a lot of the things that we'd been learning about at Animal Think Tank. So, yeah, Project Phoenix was born, and our mission at Project Phoenix is to build the power of the UK animal freedom movement into an unstoppable force for change. So we see ourselves as a movement building organization. We don't really see ourselves as a sort of campaigning organization. We see ourselves as a movement building engine, an engine that can build a movement with real power behind it, a movement that can be mainstream and bold and coordinated and can act at scale when trigger events happen. So yeah, for us, that means, growing this grassroots network, hundreds of community-led campaigning groups across the UK, mass leadership development, alignment between grassroots and NGOs, a bold narrative of animal freedom, and building a movement that people feel excited to join. So I would say, where Animal Think Tank focuses on research and narrative strategy and movement strategy, at Project Phoenix, we're focusing on implementing those learnings, building the grassroots base, building networks, shifting culture and narratives. And I think both the research side and the implementation side are really important, and they feed off each other.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. Animal Think Tank lives on though, right? It's still going.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Good. Yeah, you said you kind of like you've been, it's almost like you've kind of been in graduate school through Animal Think
Yes.
Tank, kind of learning about movements, and now you're getting into the action. You're jumping in and actually doing the work.
Yeah.
Very, very cool. So I know that through Animal Think Tank, you studied a lot of social movements, including the history of the UK movements, which is similar to the US. I think the trajectory is similar to the US animal advocacy movement. What lessons from like past social movements or even more recent social movements do you think that the animal advocacy movement can apply? What can we learn from other social movements?
Oh gosh, we can learn so much. And this is a really big question, but I will, yeah, try and answer concisely. When I've looked at past social movements, so we're talking about civil rights, marriage equality, women's suffrage, disability rights, so many past and present social movements. For me, a very clear pattern emerges. And I think the most important thing, and I think the insight and learning that really is powering so much of the work that we're doing at Project Phoenix, is this idea that ordinary people, when organized at scale, can create breakthroughs. And civil disobedience and direct action and protest have played such an important role in pretty much all transformative progressive social movements that we can think of. And I think successful movements tend to combine a few essential ingredients. So yeah, there's strong grassroots organizing, a bold sort of unifying narrative, shared goals and coordination across different parts of the movement ecosystem. And I think the ability to act quickly when opportunities arise or when trigger events happen. And when we look at the UK animal movement's history, I think that this shows, very similar things. Our biggest wins in the UK historically have been bans on fur farming, wild animals in circuses, bans on hunting foxes with dogs, ban on cosmetic testing. These were powered not by a few NGOs, but by hundreds of local groups and thousands of ordinary people coming together and creating persistent public pressure, engaging in storytelling, really compelling moral storytelling, and this public pressure that they created was what then gave NGOs the leverage to codify these things into law. Now, from the early 2000s onwards, the grassroots ecosystem and network in the UK eroded for reasons including state repression. And since then, we've become more professionalized and more centralized, and we've lost those sort of deep community roots that I think made our historic movement so powerful. But I think the key lesson for me is you can't skip the base. Like, power has to be grown from the ground up. So like that is, I think, the major lesson for me. People power is the base, the foundation, the most important thing that we need to build. I think another lesson is recognizing that ending animal exploitation isn't just it's not a complicated problem, it's a complex problem. We're not just trying to fix a single policy or shift consumer preferences. Like we're trying to transform a whole cultural and economic system that has been normalized for centuries. And in complex problems and challenges like this, change, meaningful, transformative change doesn't come from one master plan or one theory of change. It emerges from a healthy ecosystem of different roles, different actors, different theories of change working in synergy. So in our case, we've got, well, in actually, when you look at any really successful social movement, you've got I think they talk about five foundational theories of change. So individual transformation. So for us, that's vegan outreach, creating alternatives. So for us, that would be things like sanctuaries, plant-based alternatives, plant-based or veganic farming. The inside game, so that's working within the system to create change. So that's NGOs doing policy work, it's lobbying, strategic litigation, party politics, corporate reform. So that's the inside game. And then we've got the outside game, which is sort of community-based grassroots organizing, and then protest and direct action. And the outside game is really about shifting public opinion. And so each of these roles and theories of change matter, but the real power comes from the synergy between them. And it becomes more than the sum of its parts. So I feel like the ecosystem approach and framework that you see in successful social justice movements is a really important framework for us to be using in the animal movement. And then I think sort of within that framework, we see that the catalyst that can really shift the Overton window and open up opportunities for the rest of the ecosystem, it comes from the outside game of grassroots organizing, of protest, of direct action. So again, I guess we're going back to lesson one, which is that the outside game, the grassroots organizing, is super, super important, and it enables so much of what is happening in the rest of the ecosystem. And I think that's a lesson for us, because when I look at the UK movement, we are, I would say, very out of balance. We've got quite an overdeveloped NGO or inside game, and the grassroots organizing and the mass participation is currently very underdeveloped. And, without a strong base, yes, we can raise awareness and we can win incremental reforms, but we can't build the sustained pressure that we need for systemic change.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I could go on. Shall I carry on with
Well,
more lessons?
no, that was all wonderful. Really just great social justice change 101.
Yeah.
And yeah, and something that so many of us that are working on this stuff just don't know or think about. So I think that it's really important. I love digging into this stuff. And I think we've had a similar path, a similar trajectory in the US as the UK, in that we had a really strong grassroots base in like the 80s, the 90s, even the early 2000s, heavily grassroots with the outside game, as you talk about, individual outreach, encouraging consumers to go vegan. And I think we did very well, as you did in the UK. We had a lot of successes. Vegan is now a household name, and that is because of that grassroots
Yeah.
work. So we did a lot of great work. But I think now something shifted, and I've heard that this happens in other movements as well. This is not unique to the animal rights movement, but once there's that energy and build, then there can be this kind of dramatic shift to the other side, and having all the emphasis be on the inside game, the what for us is welfare campaigns and corporate campaigns and legislative campaigns and cage free and all of that, because of the fantastic work that the grassroots did of raising the awareness, getting donors, getting people involved and excited that have money and power and all that. And now we have this shift, right, that happens, and we're out of balance. I've seen it in real time. I've been in this movement for 30 years, and I was, in the streets in the 80s and 90s with the grassroots, and I've seen this shift, and now we are really out of balance, I believe. And I know you do too, and so many of us do, with the energy and resources and jobs and everything going to welfare washing, a great term that actually I got from you. Now the grassroots and vegan education and even farmed animal sanctuaries and other more grassroots efforts are really being starved for funding and support. How do you think we can bring this all back into balance? How can we regain the power of the grassroots? I know that's part of what Project Phoenix is doing, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on all that.
Sure. I mean, before I answer that, I would say that, yeah, I totally agree that this is what happens. This is a pattern that happens in social movements as, resources come in, as attention comes in, that there's a sort of bid to kind of professionalize.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And then I suppose that there's a lot of energy that gets taken out of the grassroots as they get funneled up into NGO positions, and we all have to live in this capitalist system and pay our
Yep.
mortgages and all the rest of it. So no
Yeah,
judgment from me.
sure.
I feel like the sort of the incentives are there, and we have to really fight against this sort of the structures in order to kind of keep that sort of grassroots volunteer spirit and culture alive.
Yeah.
But one thing I would say is that, like, not everybody who is in the NGO space, I would say, is sort of engaging in welfare washing. I do think that there's a lot of really good stuff that happens
Yes,
in the sort of,
absolutely. No, that's
yeah.
good.
So
Yeah. Good
just
to
to
say.
clarify,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm sure we'll get onto the welfare washing part, which I do think is an issue, and I think it's quite a big problem for our movement. So yeah, over the past decade in the UK or more, yeah, as you say, in the US, the movement really has in the UK swung very heavily towards the inside game. So yeah, as you've said, the corporate reforms, the policy work, incremental welfare campaigns and improvements. And I do think that these approaches have their place, they can reduce harm. But the problem that I see is that when these types of campaigns and approaches become the center of gravity, but when they dominate the movement, then we're losing something that's really essential. Yeah, as you've asked, how do we regain the power of the grassroots? How do we regain the people power that was there before? I feel that we need to do a lot of the things that I think we're trying to do at Project Phoenix, which is to build up local groups in every community. So not just in a handful of major cities, but for us, it's all over the UK. We want local groups in every town and city across the UK, groups that are visible, that they're a welcoming presence, that groups that people can walk into, feel at home in, and grow their activism and their political consciousness and their relationships. When I went vegan, I looked around because I wanted to take action and I couldn't find anywhere that I could plug into, really. There was no local group that I could go to that was doing local campaigning. So local groups everywhere, I would say. I think we also need to invest in leadership development, mass leadership development. Movements grow when ordinary people become organizers, trainers, spokespeople, campaigners. We build power by developing people, not just by running events. So that's something that we're really investing in through boot camps, through our resources, through coaching.
Yeah, and
Um,
you've talked about these three kinds of power that long-term movement building really needs: the people power, network power, and narrative power. Do you want to talk
yeah,
about those?
yes, for sure. So, I mean, I think basically, if you look at successful social movements, it's very clear that these movements that are successful are the ones that can really build long-term power to transform the status quo. And, power is a big word. There are lots of different power frameworks that we could draw from, but the one that we quite like at Project Phoenix, there's 4 forms of power that we need to build in order to shift and transform the status quo. There's people power, there's network power, there's narrative power, and then there's institutional power. So people power is the foundation. It is what we think it is. It's, the ability to mobilize thousands, tens of thousands of people when it matters. Because without, organized people, like, nothing really moves. So that's why we're investing in, building a network of community-led campaigning groups that can recruit others to the movement, that can achieve local wins, and that can come together for national campaigns. So that's the base. That's people power. That's the foundation. And then we need to build network power. So strong groups and organizations aren't going to be enough if they're isolated. So network power means building trust, coordination, shared direction across grassroots groups, across grass tops or NGOs, across all the sort of allied individuals and organizations, whether they're sanctuaries, storytellers, researchers, academics, journalists, and it's this connective sort of infrastructure that can help the ecosystem to work in synergy, that can, share information, lessons can be shared. This is how innovation happens. And it also helps with mobilizing really quickly when there's trigger events, and also, helps with collective learning, which is what we need because we're facing a complex challenge and we're functioning in a complex system. So the network power is really building that connective infrastructure so that we can function as a kind of an organism and respond and experiment and innovate our way to making progress. So then there's narrative power, and narrative power is what shapes, I guess,
actually,
oh,
before you get to narrative power, I
yeah,
have questions, if I could, if that's
sure,
okay,
sure,
about
yeah,
people power and network power.
yeah,
So with people power and network power, I feel like this is kind of how you would respond to the trigger event. So this you mentioned
yes,
this before, the trigger events
yeah,
that I find really interesting because
yeah,
I think through Animal Think Tank I've read the work that you did around these trigger events and how powerful they can be for a movement
yeah,
when something happens in the whatever the media zeitgeist, or something happens like George Floyd here in the US. That would be a really good example of a trigger event that sparked the Black Lives Matter movement. And so the only way to really take advantage of a trigger event, something that happens that you can respond to, is to have that people power and that network power so that we can mobilize in the streets or online or wherever it is we need to respond to a trigger event, right? Do you want to talk about? I think that's really fascinating.
yeah. No, I mean, and to be honest, I feel like you've explained this very well, and you've said what I would say. Yeah, I think in social movements, trigger events are so important. And there's a social movement practitioner and theorist called Bill Moyer who wrote a book called Doing Democracy, and he has this movement cycle graph in there, and basically. And he's also got these different roles: the rebel role, the reformer role, the citizen, and the change maker. So there's a nod to the ecosystem, but also the different roles are important at different times in a social movement cycle.
Yeah.
And the takeoff of the social movement follows a trigger event. And the trigger event happens, and then the rebel role, which is your outside game activist, direct action protester, comes to the fore. And that is when the movement takes off and really sort of blows up into public consciousness.
Mm.
And it is much later in the movement cycle that the inside game, the NGOs, come to the fore to sort of codify that shift in public opinion that has happened into laws, into changes in corporate policies, etc. So I feel like trigger events and our ability to respond to trigger events and that rebel role is so important if we want our movement to take off into a sort of new cycle.
Yeah.
And George Floyd is a brilliant example of a trigger event. I would say that there are trigger events happening all the time. Anytime an animal escapes from a slaughterhouse or a
Yeah.
truck,
Yeah.
these open rescues that are happening.
Mm.
In the UK last year, there was this calf who had escaped from a farm and was running down a sort of residential street and was rammed repeatedly by a police car in order to stop them.
Oh.
And people were coming out of their houses like completely shocked and distraught at what was happening to this calf, who Animal Rising named Bo and really tried to organize something around. But I remember at the time like messaging, people in other organizations and saying we need to do something, but we just did not have everybody agreed, but it was like we didn't have the capacity to
Mm.
really respond at scale. What we needed was a local group that was in that neighborhood or in that sort of town to go and protest at the police station and create some kind of a media sort of moment. And
Yeah.
that we just don't have that capacity yet.
Mm.
And even though organizations did try to do something, I think there was some legal thing that happened. But this was just one of many things that we could have turned into a trigger event.
Right.
Um,
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So amazing. Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to kind of that's kind of the power of the people power and the network power,
yeah.
right? So yeah. So okay. Now going on to narrative power. So we have people power, network power, and now tell us about narrative power. And this kind of relates to language and how we communicate, which I really love. So yeah, talk about narrative power.
Great. So narrative power really is about shaping, having the power to shape what society believes is acceptable and what it can imagine changing. So it's, if we think about the ideas that people live by, it's like it's the stories and the beliefs and the narratives that, really influence our beliefs, our norms, our culture. So we need to build the power to shift these narratives. And it is definitely language, but I think it's also framing, it's messages that really persuade, that really speak to people's values. And, if we think about our movement, if the animal freedom movement sort of dominant story is, cruelty versus higher welfare, then, the horizon of what's possible stays quite small. But for us at Project Phoenix, we really believe that the narrative that we need to be centering is the narrative around freedom, the idea that other animals have lives of their own to lead as they wish. And when we center stories like freedom, we will then widen, the public's imagination, and the horizon gets much bigger in terms of what we can achieve. So I think a really important part of what we need to learn how to do is to connect the incremental wins, these incremental campaigns that all of us are going to have are doing. It's not like it's only welfare, people who are engaged in welfare who are doing incremental change. We're all, we're not going to get from 0 to 100 in one go. So it's being able to connect these incremental campaigns and wins to a bigger vision, to a bigger story.
Yeah.
And so narrative power really is having the power to shape these ideas that people live by. Often a narrative and sort of cultural shift comes before legislation changes.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I feel in a way that we're kind of jumping the gun. We're moving to the legislative before we have the mass support of people. I don't know. It feels like we're jumping ahead with what we're doing now. But getting back to narrative power, I love some of the things that you've said about like animals having freedom to play, freedom to choose their friends, freedom, things like that. I mean, things that we don't really talk about much because we're so focused on the suffering.
Yeah, so this idea of freedom to play or using these really sort of emotive kinds of words, I think was very inspired for us at Animal Think Tank by the Freedom to Marry movement.
Oh,
And even though the campaign was about, it was an incremental campaign, it was like marriage equality. Evan Wolfson, the person who I think was at the center of the campaign, was very clear that he focused on marriage as a kind of symbol of something bigger, of love, commitment, of really using that campaign to help shift the narrative around how people see gay people, how people relate to gay love. Even though marriage, is was seen as something that was not necessarily that radical. It's an incremental step, but the narrative that went with it actually moves society forward in quite a big way. So
yeah.
we were thinking at Animal Think Tank around, okay, so incremental change. So, welfare improvements can be, these incremental steps if they are framed in ways that help people, the public, society see other animals in new ways. So freedom to play, doesn't that evoke sort of childhood and innocence? And it helps people remember that these are babies who also feel joy and want to play. And it's not just about avoiding suffering, it's about living full lives and thriving.
Yeah.
So I think these types of reframings of incremental campaigns have a huge potential for us to shift the story and to shift society in a much more pro-animal direction.
And then the last power was institutional power. Did you want to mention that one?
Yeah, so this is the power to influence decision making. So this is also really, really important, but it's not something that Project Phoenix is focusing on. But as people power, network power, and narrative power grow, they give NGOs and policymakers and the inside game players the leverage that they need to push for deeper structural change. And so I think if movements only focus on one form of power or one part of the ecosystem, they're going to fail. So I think all of these types of power are needed if we're going to have any chance of making the transformative change for animals that they so desperately need.
Yeah, and talking about the institutional power and the inside game, something I said earlier, I do just want to kind of clarify that and I think you said it too. I agree that people that are working, these, vegan activists that are working in these NGOs on corporate campaigns or cage-free campaigns or whatever, I know they're going in with good intention and they're wanting to do what they can for the animals, and that's all the jobs that are available. So I don't blame anyone for taking one of those jobs. And anyway, just wanted to clarify that. I have deep respect for anyone who does anything for animals and dedicates their life to animals. So yeah. So, talking about narrative power, kind of bringing it back to narrative power, I had something I wanted to ask about that. So, we're seeing so much around humane washing, welfare washing, as you've called it, both in products and consumer facing, as well as in the animal advocacy spaces, kind of working on those kinds of campaigns. How does the humane hoax kind of undermine what we're trying to do there with reclaiming the animal freedom story or narrative? Actually saying that animals should not be exploited and commodified at all. There's a tension there for sure. Do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I agree. I do think there is a tension there. And, if we think about narrative power as being about, the stories that we tell to shape what society believes is possible, then if the dominant narrative that the public is hearing from us is about welfare, so whether it's bigger cages or slower growing chickens or quote unquote higher welfare meat, um, as much as these campaigns can reduce suffering in the short term, but if the welfare story becomes the dominant story, then something I think quite concerning can happen. And I think it narrows the horizon of what feels possible to people. And I think our job as a social movement, as animal advocates, is to expand and help people reimagine what feels possible. And I think, the industry is very good at co-opting our language, and, humane washing or welfare washing, as we like to call it, is, one of their most effective tools. Terms like high welfare, ethical farming, cage free, free range, space to thrive. It uses the language of compassion and freedom that we use, but it co-opts it to protect, a system fundamentally built on exploitation. So it's allowing the public to feel reassured rather than outraged. And it pulls the rug out in a way of us actually being able to convince people that this system really needs challenging. And I think something that's quite concerning to me is that, okay, fine, this is the industry narrative. And this is what the industry is coming back with as a response to the movement and animal advocates' narrative. But then when animal organizations, pro-animal organizations, are also using these kind of very welfare-centric narratives and stories, the system becomes even harder to see for people and even harder to question. So I think the key risk for me is that if the public believes the problem is cruelty, they will look for kinder versions of exploitation. But if the public believes the problem is the denial of freedom, then they start to question the system itself. And I think that distinction is it's so important.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think what we, are arguing for at Project Phoenix, or what we feel is really compelling is that we need to reclaim the narrative of freedom. That has to be the sort of central narrative and message that people are hearing from the animal freedom movement. We're emulating this from other successful movements. The Freedom to Marry movement. They ended up reframing, marriage equality, reframed their campaign and fight away from being a technical debate about rights that wasn't landing with people to be a story about love and family and the freedom to marry and to commit. Disability rights activists shifted from a narrative of charity to a narrative of freedom and inclusion and agency, and that shifted so much. This is not just, I suppose, what we think about intuitively that we need to do, but we're also drawing on stories from other social movements that have been successful
Yeah.
when freedom and these types of big sort of universal human values have been centered, because it can really shift hearts and minds and it can really expand that horizon. So I think what we really need is we need to root our incremental wins inside a bigger narrative. And I think we need to keep freedom as our North Star. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, so well said. And yeah, it seems to me like the labels, the campaigns to get these labels like cage-free campaigns, it's almost like we've given up on the idea that we could have animal freedom, that this could all end. And we're just, like, oh, well, at least they're not suffering as much. And it really appeases, I think, consumers into thinking that, oh, well, there can be a right way, there can be a good way to have mass amounts of chickens in a building and take their eggs and they're living happy lives. No, of course not. We know, everyone that works on these things know that the ultimate goal is to not have chickens commodified at all, to not have any animal ever commodified or exploited, to have them all free. But these labels just give that appearance that there is a different story or a different ending, right? I mean, it's something so important, that piece that you just said of the larger goal, the ultimate goal with all these incremental changes is animal freedom, right? Complete animal freedom, having no animal commodified at the hands of humans. So how do we do that? How can we? I don't know if you have the answer. We're all trying to work on what the answer is. But how can we get everyone on the same page? Because that's part of the networking piece that you're talking about, is having everyone that's doing the welfare campaigns and the legislative campaigns and also the grassroots all on the same page with our larger message of animal liberation, right? Animal freedom.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
Oh, I mean, I think this is a massive question. I don't have the answer if there is
Yeah.
even such a thing. I would say that I don't think we're ever going to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah.
I feel like that's not going to happen. But I think what we can hope for is that if we are connected as individuals, as organizations, if we understand each other's theories of change, if we understand each other's motivations, if we build trust, if we build relationships, then information can start flowing and we can really understand, because most of the people that I know who are working on cage free, on corporate campaigns, are very, very committed vegans
Yeah. Yeah.
who, and I think you mentioned this. It's like it's almost as though there's some people who don't believe that we can get to animal freedom, and I do feel like there's some. This is what I've sort of felt talking to people who are doing the more corporate campaign stuff. It's like the time frame is much longer, and we're talking about hundreds of years, whereas I think the time frame for the people that I hang out with is potentially much shorter if we can put everything that we've
Yeah.
got into
Yeah.
building a mass movement that has this bold story of freedom and that can really shift things. I think that there is this difference in terms of how long a time frame that people think how long it's going to take to get to ending animal exploitation.
But my concern with the welfare campaigns, with the cage-free campaigns, is that there possibly is no end in sight. That
Yeah.
that this is, so this is actually another question that I had for you. So I'm going to move this into another question. And that's about you talk about having the importance of strategy being designed to be coherent. And my concern with welfare campaigns is that they aren't coherent or cohesive. And you said in your article that you posted recently, you said, and I'll quote here, welfare and abolition are not enemies. They can be steps on the same road. But to reach our intended destination, freedom should always be at the center of the movement's story. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. And I really agree with this. But I think that each campaign needs to be independently analyzed, right? Each thing needs to be looked at independently. Is this tactic effective? And I think the question really needs to be, does this campaign lead us in the direction of animal freedom? And I think some welfare campaigns do. But I think for a lot of them, the answer is no. And especially something like cage free or any of the alternative labels, a lot of the alternative labels, it takes consumers in kind of a side direction of just more animal consumption, just a different animal product, more money for the industry. So I don't see that as a path to animal freedom for those particular campaigns. So, what do you look for in a campaign to kind of assess if it's a good strategy?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, I mean, I agree that the what we're looking for is, does this campaign move us in the direction that we want to go, and in the direction of animal freedom? So, does the campaign meaningfully move society towards a world where animals are no longer owned, confined, or killed?
Yeah.
And I think what I would look for, and I say this with a big caveat that I'm not an experienced campaigner. You know, we're obviously doing campaigns at Project Phoenix, but in terms of the reading, the research, and our thinking, I think there's a few things. I think because we're so focused on movement building and power building, I think, you know, one of the first things that we look at in terms of whether we should do a campaign or not is, does it build people power? Does it bring in new people? Does it strengthen local groups? Does it grow confidence? Because ultimately, like, we need to grow the power in order to have the big wins to do with, you know, ending the farming of animals. I think if a campaign doesn't expand participation, I think that that's a red flag for me. Now, a lot of people
Hmm.
who work on welfare campaigns will say that actually welfare does bring in people who might not be so interested in the sort of the bolder asks. And I think that's fair. But then my question is, okay, where do they go next? Because really we want to bring in people with all different types of campaigns, but they need to be kind of then on some kind of conveyor belt or ladder, where they then get exposed to other things, and then start to really see the whole, you know, the whole picture. So does it build people power? Does it build narrative power? Does the campaign reinforce the idea that animals are individuals with lives of their own, or does it reinforce the idea that the problem is simply cruelty that can be made better or fixed through,
Right.
you know, improved standards or
Yeah.
better shopping choices? And I mean, I think this is the issue that I think is so concerning to you and to me. You know, if the narrative centers welfare as the solution, then we are risking locking the public into a welfare frame, which, as I've said, you know, narrows what people believe is possible. But if the narrative points towards freedom, you know, even while we're asking for something incremental, it expands the public imagination. So I think the story we are telling through the campaign is just as important as the tactic. And you know, the question for me isn't, is a welfare campaign good or bad? It's, does this campaign move us forward? Really, you know, I think probably related to this, it's does the campaign weaken the system or does it legitimize it? You know, some wins, I think, strengthen the industry by improving the public image of the industry. I think this is what we're talking about with some of these labels. You know, they create these sort of premium high-end markets. They lower the urgency of the issue. So, you know, I think we can argue that some of these campaigns are actually extending how long it's going to take to end the system rather than accelerating it.
Yeah.
And, you know, does the campaign reinforce the idea that exploitation can be humane? And I think a really good campaign exposes the contradictions in the system and makes exploitation harder to justify, harder to defend. And I think this is where the welfare campaigns, the corporate campaigns that you know, a big part of the movement find really concerning. I think this is the issue, because I think, you know, many of us feel that they actually legitimize the system that we're trying to dismantle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I also feel that then with things like the freedom to play, or I don't know, the reframing of these sort of campaigns in more emotive, more values-based language could help. Because really we could have welfare campaigns that really still center individual stories and talk about being steps on the road to a day when, you know, animals are no longer used for food. I'm sure there's better ways to phrase that and to craft, compelling messages around that. But I'm not seeing so much of that in the movement.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the local groups that we have in the animal freedom movement is, or a few of them actually, are focused on a campaign around banning live exports. Now, that's a welfare campaign, but the message that they're using messaging that is much broader than, oh, we need to improve welfare. It is shifting people's perceptions, even though it's a welfare campaign, because it's helping people to think about, what these animals are going through and should they be going through that at all. So I do think that there are ways, but I'm not the right person to, I'm not a narrative expert. Natalie on my team would be
Well,
excellent.
you're more of an expert than most any of us, but yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think fundamentally, in the end, I would ask about a campaign. Does this campaign grow the movement? Does the campaign shift public understanding? And does the campaign weaken the system that we're trying to dismantle? And I think if the answer is yes, then great. If the answer is no, then I think that that campaign needs to be looked at and kind of tweaked and refined. People often talk about the difference between sort of welfare and abolition, and that there is some kind of tension between incrementalism and abolition, as though welfare is incremental and abolition is asking for everything in one go. And I really feel that the campaigns that are going to be winnable, that we need to focus on, are incremental but very strategic, with a story that is much bigger than the actual campaign
Yeah.
itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Karen Davis of United Poultry Concerns taught me that back in, pre-pandemic, long ago. She was doing incremental campaigns, but with an abolitionist heart, is what she used to
Yeah.
say, with the view of the bird's freedom always central. But she would do incremental campaigns, and she got criticized for that by others in the movement that were abolitionists, saying you shouldn't be doing these specific campaigns. But she argued that no, these small things, they're kind of like trigger events in a way. I mean, it's something that you can focus on, something that you can have a narrative around, where the animals are being exploited, but then having that larger narrative of this is just a step, one of the things they endure in the multiple thing or whatever. So yeah, she's one of the ones that taught me that, and I fully agree.
I think that's so important, and I feel like this has reminded me of one extra thing that I would look at for a campaign, and that is it winnable? And does the win build momentum? Because I'm guessing that these campaigns that Karen would focus on, it's like, yes, it's something that we can focus on and we can tell a story around,
Yeah.
that makes it so much more powerful and potent than just telling stories. Because it focuses people. And I think the winning, and the winnability of campaigns matters, because again, it's there's a target, there's a focus, and I think victories can create energy and hope and belief, and build the movement and build the belief that this is a movement that can win.
Mm.
So I think, yeah, a victory that builds power, that can shift norms, that can erode, the industry, the system, corporate control, is also a really important criteria.
Well, speaking of humane washing, your new organization, Project Phoenix, has a campaign that is humane washing related, that's targeting the RSPCA's assured labeling. It's a humane labeling campaign. Can you talk about that? Maybe explain what it is and how that campaign's going.
Sure. So the RSPCA, the Royal Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, is the UK's oldest and most trusted animal charity. And it also is the only animal charity, that certifies, and to a certain extent profits from farming and killing the individuals that it is supposed to protect. So through its RSPCA assured scheme, the RSPCA, from our perspective, basically legitimizes the farming and killing of animals. And we really feel that this is very misleading to the public, because I don't know if you've seen any of the RSPCA assured adverts, but it's very just kind of bucolic family farms where animals are like really healthy and happy and have loads of space, where the
Mhm.
reality is so, so different.
Yeah.
So it's really misleading the public, and I think it's holding us back both as a movement, and as a society to shift, to a plant-based future. And I think we really need the RSPCA to be the leaders that it could be, and to be an organization that actually fights for animals and not legitimizes their exploitation. So we're calling on the RSPCA to protect all animals, not just dogs and cats, and to stop supporting cruelty and killing and be quote unquote for every kind, which is their slogan. And we know the campaign is a bit controversial, especially amongst more welfare oriented parts of the movement. They have said, the RSPCA does good work. Yes, it does. Shouldn't we be working with them? Well, we've tried to talk to them. Won't this make things worse for animals? Because the argument from the RSPCA is that we're sort of slowly ratcheting up welfare standards and sort of pushing farmers and producers to increase their welfare standards. But firstly, if you look at the standards, it's actually quite marginal in terms of the actual standards, being above the sort of basic legal standards. But secondly, there have been nearly, I think, 100 investigations over the last 16 years into RSPCA assured farms that have revealed again and again the same heartbreaking systemic level of suffering. And last year, Animal Rising investigated 37 RSPCA assured farms, and found so many welfare breaches, and produced a very good report and video. And in terms of where the campaign is now, so now we are starting again, and we've done a few actions in preparation for the new CEO's arrival. So some of the Animal Freedom Network groups disrupted an RSPCA awards gala last month, and then we did an action at their head office last week when it was the first day of the new CEO. So we did a wicked themed protest asking her if the RSPCA are going to stay wicked or change for good.
That's great.
No, it was really fun. And then we're starting sort of in earnest next year. So we've got quite a big campaign sort of escalation strategy in place. So not only do we feel that the RSPCA assured sort of label is misleading the public, and RSPCA being involved in this and having their name on it is holding the movement and society back. We also see it as a way to tell the story, I suppose, that there is no kind way to farm animals without triggering the defensiveness that we would get if we were sort of blaming individuals, or we're putting the onus on the RSPCA and like be the leaders that the animals need you to be, and sort of in the process we're exposing the reality of what happens on higher welfare farms.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think people don't realize how minimal the requirements are on some of these labels. I mean, like the American Certified Humane label, it's, I mean, there is basically no change from the way one chicken is raised to another or one pig is held captive to another, other than very, very small things like the size of their confinement being just inches more. Which, yeah, I want them to have more space. Absolutely. That's something good, and we should work towards that. However, putting a humane label, when people see these labels, they think something very different than the reality. And then the added thing of having it be the RSPCA, this trusted, animal protection, it's very, very frustrating. I'm glad you all are working on that. And it really shows too, I think, the speciesism in our view of animals, because here they're going to rescue dogs and cats, protect horses, and well, but we can still eat the cows. Just give them a little better condition. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It is frustrating. And I think sometimes when I wonder, are we doing the right thing? I just have to look at an RSPCA assured advert and I'm infuriated. And I'm
Yeah.
like, yes. So it's very misleading, because then when you look at the reality, it is so, so far from what they show.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for doing that work. Layla, I feel like I could talk to you all day. We have so much to cover. I have things I still want to ask you, but we do need to wrap up. So maybe we'll have you on again sometime. I would love that.
Oh, that would be very great. I would love that too.
Good. We'll continue digging deep. But for now, we need to wrap up with our final question. So, what gives you hope for the future?
Gosh. Okay, so I think what gives me hope, I think when I see ordinary people who are given just a little support to organize where they are, when a local group comes alive, when, they have 10 or 20 or 30 people meeting regularly, taking action, building confidence, and seeing their courage grow, seeing people discovering their own power. And, that really reminds me and gives me hope that, change doesn't begin in boardrooms and in parliament. It can begin in living rooms and these community halls where ordinary people come together. So I think working on the Animal Freedom Network and seeing our local groups and activists become organizers and local groups grow, that's giving me a huge amount of hope. I'm also, I'm always very deeply moved by what history teaches us. This is why I love reading about and learning about social movements that have been successful. So many things that once felt impossible, ending slavery, women voting, marriage equality, now just feel very obvious. And, they didn't happen because society was ready. They happened because people refused to shrink their vision. They kept telling a bigger story. They built the power to make that story real. And I think remembering that makes it easier to have hope and to believe that animal freedom too can move from being unthinkable to radical to common sense to eventually becoming inevitable. And I think the last thing, I really feel that hope, or my hope anyway, is not something passive. I really love Joanna Macy, and she calls this active hope, the kind that we can practice through our actions. Hope is something that we have to generate it by showing up, by organizing, by connecting, by building, by refusing to look away. So, every time someone joins a local group, every time a local group wins a small victory, every time one person speaks the truth about animal freedom with clarity and, with moral courage, like we create the future that we're trying to move towards. So, yeah, hope for me isn't a feeling that I wait for. I think it's a discipline. I think it's a commitment. It's a choice to act. It's a choice to act as though we can radically transform the world and that transforming it is possible.
Wow. Well, Laila, you are so inspiring to me. I am so grateful that you have taken the path you have and given us so much hope, so much good information about how we can do this. I appreciate the work you're doing, and I love that you believe it is possible. That we can have animal freedom in a short period of time, in a relatively short period of time. I love all of that. And I'm going to read a quote from your latest post that I loved just to wrap us up. Movements that win do not mirror public opinion, they expand moral imagination. They show people what freedom looks like before most believe it's even possible. Thank you, Laila. Thanks for being on the podcast, and thank you for all the work you're doing for animals.
Oh, thank you, Hope. Thanks for the kind words. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. And thank you too for everything that you're doing and being bold and courageous and speaking your truth with such clarity.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. Laila had so much great information in there. I was taking notes as I was editing, things that I want to remember as I am thinking about, talking about, and writing about animals. One thing I loved is maintaining a freedom centered story. I really, really like that. We focus so much on the suffering, on the individual procedures and things that animals endure. And as Laila said, easing suffering is not the same as ending injustice, ending exploitation. There's so much that we need to update in our thinking and our language around animal issues. And yes, animal suffering matters and individual suffering matters. And that's, good to talk about. But what is the end goal? Not just relieving the suffering and continuing exploiting and commodifying and confining animals, right? No, there's a bigger picture, animal liberation. So we've got to keep that, right, in our minds, in our language as our end goal. And then, when assessing the effectiveness of a strategy or a campaign, Layla said, does the campaign weaken the system of oppression or does it legitimize it? And wow, we have to look at that, right? Every tactic, every action, we should weigh and calculate this. I really loved that. And another thing she said that I thought was so powerful is she said that we can move the liberation of animals from unthinkable to radical to common sense to inevitable. So good to contemplate. We have to believe that it's possible. And each of us is doing our part to move us on that path, to point us in the direction of inevitable, to a day when it would be unthinkable to exploit an animal, commodify an animal, to use their bodies, their bodily fluids. I long for that day, and Layla helps me to believe that that is possible. So please share this episode with your friends. If you're listening on a podcast app, scroll to the ratings and give this one a 5-star rating. Apply what you've learned, get inspired to get active for animals, and live vegan.